Alright, it's time to make a sheath for this bee-themed knife with the honeybees in this resin and aluminum honeycomb inlay and the curly maple handles. So I want to stick with that bee theme on the sheath. So I'm going to make a sheath pretty much like a lot of them I've made, and in a recent video I showed how to make patterns if you want to angle the sheath. And this one's going to be angled to where the knife is going to lay kind of along its spine. And angled on the belt. I'm not going to focus too much on that, though I will show kind of the steps of making a sheath like I always do. But what I'm going to focus mostly on is I want to, like I said, make it match the knife. And that's in this case, I'm actually going to stamp a honeycomb pattern, cut into it and smash that down, and I'm going to undercut into the leather and then fill it in with epoxy, so the epoxy will actually be stuck under the upper layers of the leather around the edges of the bee. The bee could still fall out, but on a sheath it should be rigid enough that's not a problem. On something flexible, this might break and come out and pop off. But if I put it where it's going to be on the blade of the sheath, it should stay straight and not be a problem. Now to do this, I've got Undercut Bevelers for doing that particular undercut. It's a very specific sort of odd-shaped beveler that's got a toe that goes down into the leather. It'll actually slide in and cut underneath. Now also, I've made myself a little stamp just out of, I think this was a real long hex bolt that I cut off the threaded part of it and cut off the head. And then I ground into it in what used to be the head of the bolt. I ground it down to a smaller hexagon, and I ground into it with a carbide burr and then a diamond burr with a Dremel tool to create like a raised ridge around the edge. And that'll keep the stamp from walking and bouncing side to side whenever I go to stamp it. So that raised ridge around the edge makes stamps a lot easier to use and keep them where you want them to be without them bouncing around and moving. So with that, we're going to get to cutting some leather and start making the sheath. If anybody is wondering why it seems like I kind of started out in the middle of the piece of leather when I'm laying it out rather than going right over here in the corner, it's because this is a double shoulder. And when I'm laying it out on here, there's some stretch marks as we get over into the sides here in the kind of the cow's armpit area basically. So I don't want those in the sheath. So I'm going to go ahead and cut and avoid those stretch marks and lines. It wastes some leather, but I can always use that for something else later that it doesn't matter, like spacer pieces, which I'm going to have to cut one of anyway, will probably come out of that leather. Okay, we're going to take a little bit off of this up here, just to make it a little easier to get the knife to go into the sheath. It's rounded off up there on the top of the spacer. And we're going to actually skive this piece feather skive it out, because that's going to be stuck in that fold in the sheath. We want that to go down to nothing so that it will fold down nice over that. And one more thing before we are done cutting leather is I want to go ahead and cut a piece to line this. It's one of those steps that's not always considered necessary by everybody, but I think it makes a lot nicer finished product, even if it adds some time and extra cost on materials. In this case, I'm making this for a family member, so I don't need to worry too much about that extra cost of materials. I'd rather make something nice for them. Alright. Not the absolute best stamping I've ever done, but not bad for a stamp that I've never even used before. And matter of fact, nobody's used it before because I made it out of a bolt yesterday morning. Yeah, now I said that's not really perfect, but it's close. I want the bees to sit somewhere on the blade portion of this. So I'm probably going to put one down here. The blade's going to be right in this area, down. Put another one up here. And we kind of point them in different directions as they just wander about. And again, these are just little bee charms that I found on Amazon. I explained this when I was making the knife scales, but that was probably a separate video. And I just took, there's a loop here that to attach to a charm bracelet, and I just took and ground that off. And they look like little antennae now. And I'm going to set them in the same way that I set this one in. Basically, cut in, undercut bevel around the edges, and then epoxy it in. And the epoxy will sit in that undercut. This is the undercut beveler I was talking about, where it goes down to a point off to the side. And it just sort of glides into the leather. And instead of walking sideways like a normal beveler, its toe cuts further in. It can usually be used to add more depth to a carving. I actually don't know if I've ever heard of anyone using one like this to set something in epoxy on the leather. We're then going to use some background tools. Just to add some nice deep texture there for the epoxy to grab onto. So between that and the undercut, it should hold pretty well. Grab our modeling tool and you can kind of see what I'm talking about with the undercut. You can sort of push the leather up. I'll go ahead and do that. I'll put the epoxy in and get it underneath there. And then I can sort of push the leather back down into the epoxy. I think I also have to dye this before I put the bees and epoxy them in. And I'm using a walnut oil dye on this. And it can be a surprising color sometimes. It goes on really dark, but sometimes it'll dry really light brown. Actually, most times if you let it dry all the way, it'll turn a really light brown. Okay, now that's all trimmed, and I did bevel the edges, so I might have to go back and bevel them again a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and stitch. And sometimes when you stitch, the leathers can shift a little bit, which is why I might have to do a little bit more trimming and beveling. But I'm going to go ahead and take it to the machine, stitch this all up. Not stitch this closed yet, because I'm going to come back, finish these edges. Okay, now that that's all finished up and belt loop is sewn, it does fit 1.5-inch belt. I'm going to glue in the spacer piece, stitch all this up, grind, and then dye and finish and slick all these edges. And then it should be ready to just shape it to the knife and we'll be done.